Chapter 17. The distinctive faculties of the soul. Having now logically and scientifically demonstrated the existence in man of a dual mind, it remains to inquire what are the legitimate logical and scientific conclusions to be derived from that fact. In doing so, the first matter to be considered is the question as to what can be taken for granted. As I have pointed out in the earlier chapters of this book, there is, in every process of reasoning, one factor in the series of steps or propositions leading to a logical conclusion that is always taken for granted. Thus, in reasoning by induction, we collate our facts and from them we reason up to general principles. That is to say, after the observance of a series of phenomena, when we find a constant recurrence of the series in orderly and unvarying sequence, we are enabled to say with certainty that the same phenomena will continue to recur in the same orderly sequence. In other words, we have discovered the law which governs the subject matter, the principle which underlies it. But in formulating the law, we invariably assume, without formally stating it, the most important proposition in the series which gives it validity. That proposition is that nature is ever constant. It is obvious that if a law of nature operated in one way at one time, and in the opposite way at another, man would be put to permanent intellectual confusion. He could never be certain that he knew anything. In logical reasoning, therefore, our very silence regarding the constancy of nature evinces, in terms more eloquent than words, our calm, unfaltering trust in the wisdom and benevolence of the eternal lawgiver. So universal is this confidence among civilized peoples that the proposition that nature's laws are immutable is not only never questioned, but is, by common consent, regarded as one of those self-evident propositions which to argue is a work of supererogation. In the domain of psychological research, there is also a proposition equally important and unqualifiedly self-evident, which is assumed without question by all who apply the principles of logical reasoning to the solution of psychological problems. That proposition is that there is no faculty, emotion, or organism of the human mind that has not its function, use, or object. In the physical world, it has long since passed into a proverb that nothing was ever made in vain. This may be true, and it probably is true, but it is far from being self-evident. For instance, it is difficult to discover the use of mosquitoes, or of venomous reptiles, or of those insects which sometimes destroy the vegetation of whole provinces and bring desolation and famine to the doors of the helpless people. Such things not only cause the unreflecting to doubt the wisdom of God, but they forcibly remind us all of the essential truth of the saying of the pious Jacobi, that nature conceals God, man reveals him. No truth is more frequently brought home to the scientific student of nature and of man than this. For the more we study physical nature, the farther God is removed from us. The more we study man, the nearer God approaches to us. Thus, the savage finds God in the most common phenomena of nature. He sees him in the lightning's flash, and in the thunder he hears his voice. Explain the phenomena to him, and his God is no longer enthroned in the storm cloud. And so it is with all who study only the phenomena of physical nature. The more one learns of the proximate causes of things, the farther away is removed the ultimate cause, and if one confines his attention to the material universe alone, he is prone to the conclusion that if it is ignorance of nature's laws that gives birth to God's, a knowledge of those laws will surely destroy them. Not so in the study of man, of whom it has been truly said that there is nothing else on earth that is truly great, and in whom there is nothing truly great but mind. It is, therefore, only by the study of the mind of man that we shall be able to apprehend the existence of God, to realize his presence, to demonstrate his immanence, or to learn anything regarding the origin and destiny of the soul. We may assume, then, as the starting point of our argument, the axiom before mentioned, namely, that there is no faculty, emotion, or organism of the human mind that has not its use or object. This is a self-evident proposition. It is axiomatic, for it is impossible to conceive its opposite. It is so evident at first sight that no process of reasoning or demonstration can make it plainer. Webster. When this can be said of a proposition, all legitimate conclusions to be deduced therefrom partake of the character of the axiom. That is, they are as necessarily true as the axiom itself. They are then scientifically demonstrated. The first fact in the order of consideration to which this axiom may be applied is that man has a dual mind. This is the primary fact which lies at the foundation of the science of the soul, for it is in a sense demonstrative of the fact that man has a soul, that is to say, if man has a soul, its mental organization must necessarily be supposed to be identified with one or the other of his two minds. Now, it has already been shown that the facts of hypnotism and of experimental surgery demonstrate that the objective mind is a function of the brain and necessarily perishes with that organ. That fact, therefore, excludes the objective mind from consideration as a possible heir to a future life, and clears the way for the consideration of the facts relating to the subjective mind, which facts must of necessity either prove or disprove its claims to immortality. The first question to be considered, then, is one of use and function, and the first inquiry is, what purpose is subserved by the two minds? In other words, if man has not an immortal soul, what possible object pertaining to this life can be subserved by the two minds that could not as well have been attained by one mind? Since it is axiomatic that nature never produces an unnecessarily complex or complicated organism, now, it must be remembered that so far as this life is concerned, the subjective mind has, primarily, but three functions, namely, I. Self-preservation, 2. Reproduction, 3. The preservation of the offspring. These may be reduced in terms to one, namely, the perpetuation of the race or species. It has other powers, as we have already seen, and as we shall see more particularly later on. Some of those powers belong exclusively to the subjective mind, whilst others differ only in degree from corresponding powers belonging to the objective mind. But the point to be considered for the moment is that the only normal functions performed by the subjective mind during its sojourn in the body, and its connection with it, all pertain to the perpetuation of the species. These are, primarily, purely animal functions, it is true, and are possessed in common with all animate nature. They are, nevertheless, its only normal functions. This is demonstrated by the fact that it can never perform any other function or exercise any other of its manifold powers, except under the most intensely abnormal conditions of the body. This proposition will be amply demonstrated in a later chapter. For the present, it must be taken for granted for the sake of the argument which follows. Is it conceivable that a power which is capable of creating man and endowing him with powers that we know him to possess could not have endowed his objective mind with the instinctive powers and functions which have been named? In other words, what is the use of such a complex and complicated organism as is involved in the mechanism of a dual mind when a unitary mind could just as well have performed all the normal functions now performed by both? It will thus be seen that the bare fact that man possesses a dual mind necessarily leads to the conclusion that one of them does not pertain exclusively to his physical well-being. Let me not be misunderstood at this point. I do not undertake to say that immortality is directly foreshadowed by the fact that man has a dual mind, and that is subjective. Mind is endowed with the faculty of animal instinct. But what I do say is that the fact that he has a dual mind, indirectly but inevitably, leads to that conclusion. It is, indeed, the fundamental basis of fact from which we may proceed to a demonstration of a future life. It is a logical as well as a physical necessity, since the objective mind is merely a function of the brain. There must, therefore, be another mind, another intellect, another entity in man, or there would be nothing upon which to predicate the hypothesis of immortality. It is, therefore, an argument for a future life in that the existence of two minds cannot be accounted for on any other rational hypothesis. I cannot be unaware that the argument is far from demonstrative so long as none of the attributes and powers of the subjective mind have thus far been taken into consideration except the purely animal instincts which we have been considering, since those functions pertain wholly to the physical plane. If all else were left out of consideration, man would be on an exact level with the brute creation, so far as the question of a future life is concerned. It would be impossible to postulate a rational hypothesis of immortality for man that would not apply with equal force to the brute, if the soul of neither was endowed with higher attributes than the instincts which belong alone to the physical plane. It is just here, however, that the difference between man and brute becomes manifest, and it is upon these lines that must be settled the vexed question whether the brute, equally with man, may not be able to read his title clear to mansions in the skies, since the former, in common with the latter, is endowed with both objective and subjective faculties. The subjective faculties of the brute are limited to those primary instincts which pertain wholly to the perpetuation of the species, and belong therefore exclusively to the physical plane. On the other hand, the subjective mind of man is endowed with intellectual faculties which far transcend those of the objective intellect, and some of which perform no normal function on the physical plane. Nor must it be forgotten in this connection that the instinct of self-preservation itself, common as it is to all animate nature, and purely selfish as it is among the brute creation, contains within itself the elements of the purest altruism. And when it is normally developed in man, it becomes the most purely unselfish of all the human instincts, and exhibits itself in the noblest acts of self-sacrifice recorded in history, the sublimest heroism conceivable by the human imagination. It was regnant in the devoted band who held the pass at Thermopylae, in Horatius, who held the bridge in the brave days of yore, in Winkelried, who swept the enemy's spears into his own body that he might break the Austrian phalanx, in the pilot who, with arms shriveling in the flames, guided his burning ship toward the shore, to the end that others might survive, in the captain of the sinking ship who stood at his post until the last passenger was safe, and was alone drawn into the vortex. In him who yielded up his life on the cross in testimony of his divine mission to bring life and immortality to light, and all those noble, self-sacrificing souls who suffer and die that others may live. These are the higher aspects of the instinct of self-preservation, for that instinct in man pertains not alone to the preservation of the individual life, but to that of the species to which it belongs. It is just as much a matter of instinct to sacrifice one's own life for the preservation of the lives of others as it is to shrink from imminent peril when one's own safety is alone involved. In a word, when the lives of others are at stake, cowardice is a purely abnormal manifestation of that instinct. Heroic self-sacrifice, when others are in peril, is alone normal. It will thus be seen that the principle of the greatest good to the greatest number is the ultimate form of the evolutionary development of what has been regarded as the most purely selfish instinct. In the lower animals it is a purely selfish, individualized instinct. In man it rises to the dignity of what, for the want of a better term, may be designated as ego-altruism, the AGIS of all humanity. It may be asked, why, if every faculty has its use or object, is the brute endowed with two minds, if neither of its minds is destined to a future life? In other words, why does not the dual-mind hypothesis argue immortality for the brute as cogently as it does for the man? It may as well be asked, why does not the possession of two eyes prove that the brute is destined to become a man? Or, why does not the presence, in various species of animals, of the rudimentary physical structure of man, argue that each individual animal is destined to become a man? The answer to all these questions is the same, namely, the creation of the physical and the psychical man is the goal toward which nature has tended from the beginning, but it was through the processes of evolution that both body and soul were created. Man's physical structure, in rudimentary form, is found in the animals from which he was evolved, but it does not follow that the individual animal is to become a man. Man's psychical organism is found, in rudimentary form, in the brute creation, the same dual mental organism being present in all animate nature, but it does not follow that the individual brute is to inherit immortality. The rudimentary form of man in the animal rendered it possible for the processes of evolution to culminate in the creation of the perfected physical man. The rudimentary psychical organism in the animal rendered it possible for evolution to elevate the embryonic soul to the full stature of a living, conscious, individualized entity capable, under certain conditions, existent in man alone, of sustaining an existence independently of the physical organism. The primary condition precedent to the attainment of such an existence is necessarily that of consciousness. It is axiomatic that no individualized existence worthy of the name can be sustained by a living organism, physical or psychical, in the absence of consciousness. It is also obvious that an animal can have no consciousness of the possession of a soul. Nor can the soul be conscious of itself in the absence of any suggestion or information conveyed to it by objective education. Jesus, who was master of the science of the soul, drew the line, on strictly scientific principles, between the man and the brute, when he proclaimed the law that faith was the essential prerequisite to the attainment of immortal life. Faith, in the sense in which Jesus employed the term, means much more than belief, although the latter is included in the term. Faith, in the psychic sense, and that is the sense in which Jesus employed it, is conscious potentiality. It is a power. It is the power of the soul. All psychic phenomena demonstrate that proposition. Without it, there can be no psychic phenomena beyond the exercise of the purely animal instincts. It is the creature of suggestion. Suggestion alone awakens it into existence. Suggestion can utterly destroy it. Inasmuch as no suggestion of the possibility of a mortal life can be conveyed to the embryotic soul of the brute, the conscious potentiality requisite to the sustentation of independent existence does not exist, and it obviously cannot exist in other than an intelligent being. And this remark, according to the philosophy of Jesus, applies to all the brute creation, whether it is embodied in the form of animals or of men. It is thought that enough has now been said to make a prima facie case, because I have shown 1. That there is a basis in the mental organism of man upon which the hypothesis of a future life can be postulated, and that a. There are two minds, b. The subjective mind does not necessarily perish with the brain, 2. That no other rational hypothesis, which will account for all the facts, psychical and physical, has yet been formulated.